This daily news podcast presents every story from multiple perspectives so listeners can think for themselves. No spin, no agenda, no outrage, just fair, thoughtful journalism. The news landscape has become deeply polarized. Most outlets lead with an angle. Most podcasts pick a side. Omni View exists because millions of thoughtful people are tired of being told what to think. They want to understand what happened, hear how different perspectives frame it, and make up their own minds. This show is the antidote to partisan media. Every episode covers the day's most important stories with real depth, always presenting at least two genuine perspectives. We cite specific sources, raise questions the coverage is not asking, and respect your intelligence enough to let you draw your own conclusions. Whether you lean left, right, or nowhere in particular, this show is built for anyone who values fairness, nuance, and intellectual honesty in a world that seems to have forgotten what those words mean. Welcome to Omni View, episode 101 for July 3rd, 2026. Balanced news perspectives. Here's the news, the perspectives, and the questions worth asking. At least 32 people died when an overcrowded bus plunged into a ravine in Pakistan, underscoring the lethal risks of long-distance travel on steep mountain roads. A bus traveling from Quetta to Peshawar crashed in the Dana Sar mountain range. At least 32 people died in the incident. The vehicle was reported as overcrowded at the time of the crash. Reporting from international outlets emphasizes the human cost on routes connecting major Pakistani cities. Local authorities face scrutiny over vehicle standards and enforcement along remote highways. Safety regulators argue that strict limits on passenger numbers and mandatory vehicle inspections prevent exactly these tragedies by addressing mechanical failure and driver overload before journeys begin. Transport operators contend that economic pressures on long routes force higher loads and older vehicles, and that blanket restrictions would cut service to remote areas without addressing underlying infrastructure gaps. What factors determine whether a route receives extra safety oversight? Shifting now to Venezuela. Rescue teams continue digging through debris following two major earthquakes that struck Venezuela. The death toll exceeds 2,000. Interim President Delcy Rodriguez has defended the government's response amid criticism. Coverage highlights ongoing efforts to locate survivors while noting public frustration with the pace of aid. Government supporters maintain that coordinating heavy equipment and medical supplies across damaged infrastructure requires time, and early claims of delay overlook the physical barriers to rapid deployment. Critics argue that pre-positioned emergency resources and clearer communication protocols could have reduced the period of uncertainty for families still waiting for news. How are priorities set when multiple sites need equipment simultaneously? Next, economic indicators from Britain. The Bank of England reported that default rates on unsecured borrowing have risen above levels seen since the financial crisis. British households are showing increased difficulty meeting payments. The data covers recent months. Financial coverage links the rise to broader cost of living pressures. Central bank data collectors maintain that tracking unsecured debt provides an early signal of consumer stress, allowing policymakers to monitor trends before they affect secured lending. Household finance advocates argue that focusing solely on defaults misses how many families are already cutting essentials to avoid missing payments, understating the true pressure. How do default figures compare with other indicators like savings rates? Turning to labor policy in Germany. New rules announced Thursday bar workers from simply calling in sick. Employees must now see a doctor for any absence, even a single day. The change targets high absenteeism and aims to support economic productivity. Business reporting frames the measure as a response to elevated sick leave figures. Policymakers focused on growth contend that verified medical need ensures resources target genuine illness while discouraging patterns that reduce overall output. Worker representatives argue that minor illnesses often resolve without medical intervention, and mandatory visits risk overwhelming clinics without addressing workplace factors that contribute to time off. What data justified the previous self-reporting system? Meanwhile, in the United States, President Donald Trump is scheduled to visit Mount Rushmore to open birthday weekend events. A separate concert in Los Angeles features Queen Latifah along with Chris Stapleton and the Smashing Pumpkins. The two celebrations reflect different approaches to the milestone. National coverage notes the geographic and stylistic contrast between the events. Traditional commemorative planners argue that sites like Mount Rushmore connect citizens to founding principles and westward expansion in a tangible way. Alternative event organizers contend that highlighting diverse musical voices and regional perspectives better reflects the country's full demographic and cultural range today. What criteria guide selection of official anniversary locations? Now a story from Europe. A woman suspected in a parcel bomb attack in Monaco has been seen in Germany. The incident wounded a Ukrainian-born oligarch, his companion, and their child. Judicial sources confirmed the sighting. European reporting tracks cross-border movement of the suspect. Law enforcement agencies maintain that rapid information sharing between jurisdictions improves chances of locating suspects before they can strike again. Civil liberties observers argue that high-profile international cases can lead to expanded surveillance powers that later apply more broadly than initially justified. What legal thresholds allow cross-border tracking in such cases? Finally, a legal development in Louisiana. A New Orleans grand jury indicted Attorney General Liz Murrill on 16 counts, including intimidation of local officials. Governor Jeff Landry stated he would issue a pardon as quickly as legally possible. State-level coverage presents the indictment alongside the governor's response. Supporters of the Attorney General maintain that vigorous oversight of local compliance with state law is a core duty and that criminal charges risk chilling legitimate enforcement actions. Local officials contend that threats of legal action against them for policy disagreements undermine separation of powers between state and city levels. What standards define intimidation in official communications? European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde declined to rule out leaving her post early. She is considering a possible move into French politics. Her current term runs until 2027. Financial outlets note the timing of her comments relative to French political developments. Markets watch for any signals about future monetary policy leadership. Central bank continuity advocates argue that predictable leadership terms help anchor inflation expectations and reduce volatility in bond markets. Political observers contend that talented public figures should retain flexibility to serve in elected roles when national circumstances change. Thousands of Mercedes-Benz employees demonstrated against planned reductions. The actions occurred at multiple German sites. The company has cited ongoing economic pressures. Labor reporting highlights worker concerns over job security. Company statements emphasize competitiveness needs. Management teams argue that controlling labor costs preserves the company's ability to invest in future models and maintain employment levels over the longer term. Union representatives contend that preserving skilled workforces during downturns allows faster recovery once demand returns. Polestar dealers who invested in showrooms will be unable to sell vehicles next year. The government denied an authorization tied to a Chinese technology ban. The decision affects planned operations. Industry coverage examines the intersection of trade policy and retail investment. Dealers describe sunk costs with uncertain recovery. Trade enforcement officials maintain that preventing access to restricted technology protects critical supply chains even when it disrupts specific commercial plans. Affected dealers argue that clear, advance guidance on compliance would allow investors to avoid commitments that later become impossible to fulfill. Bad Bunny became the first Latin American artist with a wax figure at Musée Grivas. The figure draws from his album Debí tirar más fotos. He is performing sold-out shows in Paris and Marseille. Entertainment reporting notes the milestone for Latin artists in European cultural institutions. Fans view the recognition as validation of global reach. Museum curators argue that featuring contemporary global stars keeps institutions relevant to younger and more diverse audiences. Traditionalists contend that wax figures should prioritize historical figures whose cultural impact has already been measured over decades. Sophie debuted a short bob at an agricultural festival in Hertfordshire. The cut marks her shortest style in 15 years. She has experimented with similar lengths previously. Lifestyle coverage presents the change as a personal style update. Observers note continuity with earlier looks from the 1990s. Style commentators maintain that public figures revisiting earlier looks can normalize varied appearances across life stages. Critics of media focus argue that repeated attention to appearance distracts from substantive roles and achievements. Now, to really understand how temperature records are verified and compared across decades, most coverage of record-breaking heat simply states that a new high has been set, yet the process behind confirming those records involves more steps than many realize. Weather agencies collect data from standardized stations, apply quality checks for instrument calibration and sighting, then compare readings against historical archives that may use different equipment or observation times. When a claimed record exceeds the previous mark by a wide margin, agencies often conduct additional review to rule out microclimate effects or data errors before official acceptance. Knowing this, when you hear claims that records are falling constantly, you can evaluate whether the coverage accounts for verification delays or simply reports preliminary readings. Next time you see a headline about a new temperature record, ask which agency performed the final validation, what was the previous record's date and equipment, and has the station's surroundings remained consistent over time? Tomorrow, watch for updates on whether search operations in Venezuela shift from rescue to recovery, as the days since the earthquakes continue to pass. That wraps up today's Omni View. Remember, the best informed people read more than one perspective. If this show helps you do that, share it with someone who values fair coverage. See you tomorrow. And if you'd rather watch than listen, find us on YouTube at NARA Network. Links in the show notes. And before you go, this show is part of the NARA Network, a family of daily podcasts on tech, science, and markets, each one a short, sharp briefing you can finish on the commute. If today earned its place in your feed, here's your next listen. Fascinating Frontiers, the most fascinating news from space and science. Find every show free at neranetwork.com. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.